Well, welcome everybody. Delighted to have you here, and delighted to have Raj Shah here at Stern. Raj and I worked together in the Obama administration, and I have great respect and admiration for everything Raj has done, both in the private sector but also in the public sector. We share an affiliation with a great Midwestern school, the University of Michigan. We both went there.
Go Blue.
Go Blue. And we, as I say, we were both proud members of the Obama administration team. But Raj also has a great both academic background. He, in addition to his time at Michigan, he has several degrees from University of Pennsylvania, both a business degree and a medical degree. He was a senior advisor at the Gates Foundation for a number of years, helped that foundation really play a preeminent role in a lot of issues relating to health and development. And then Secretary Clinton and President Obama brought him in to run, I think, one of the most complicated, difficult agencies, but important agencies, USAID. And I watched Raj try to tame the beast and try to engage in smart development policy for the United States, which was really a wonderful run. Raj finished that run in the government in 2015, and as of last year joined the Rockefeller Foundation as its head, and he's also doing a terrific job there. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to engage a bit on some of the things going on at Rockefeller in the world. There's a big, ambitious agenda that the foundation has. And we come to this conversation, Raj, and I really want to sort of start out with a kind of cosmic question, as it were. We're speaking on a Monday after one of the longest weeks we've had in recent memory. Lots of division within our own society, a kind of despair among many of our citizens, and a reflection of that in other parts of the world. We had also over the weekend a Brazilian election, which also continues this pattern of populist leaders basically reaching out on the basis of fear and anger to a population that feels underserved. So as a public person, as somebody who's both served in government, now in the philanthropic community, what are your reflections? Where do you see this heading, and what's the role for universities, for philanthropy, for concerned citizens as we sort of look out at this world where there is so much disconnect?
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be with you. I'm sure everyone here knows, but Professor Posner was a hero in our administration, someone who made sure America stood for human rights in the farthest corners of the globe and worked tirelessly to do that. And a lot of the brave and courageous things you did were the first time we joined the Human Rights Council, or the first time we would call out certain types of acts of violence and trafficking and the like. So I really appreciate the chance to be back with you, and congratulate you on having a human rights center at a business school, which is just fantastic, and I wish we had more of that around the world. And
we're working on that.
We'll get to talk about that. This obviously has been a very difficult time, and this weekend in particular, as a symbol of that challenge, was particularly poignant. My hearts and prayers continue to be with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh and all around the country. I happened to be at a friend's son's bar mitzvah at a synagogue when they announced that tragic shooting had taken place in Pittsburgh, and it is deeply sad for our country and the world that we have gotten to a place where hate crimes, particularly against Jewish Americans, are effectively at an all-time high. I think higher than any point since 1979, according to the Anti-Defamation League. And I feel like, in addition to our thoughts and prayers, we in the university community, in the foundation and philanthropic space, in corporate American and civic life have more of a responsibility to both call out the hatred and bigotry that underlies those ruthless acts, but also, not stop there. We have to get to a place where our civic discourse is about issues and hopefulness and bringing people together. And we have to recognize these types of acts as correlated with the hateful kind of political dialogue we see in this country. And as you point out, the populist retrenchment we see, or nationalist retrenchment, however you want to characterize it, in the Philippines and Brazil and parts of Europe. So, there's a movement out there that has recognized that it's easier to tear people apart than bring them together. And those of you in this room and online and at this great university stand for the opposite element to that. And I wish we could be projecting our voice on those issues more forcefully, especially right now.
Yeah, well, no, I totally agree with that. This last year, you've participated in a task force on extremism organized by the U.S. Institute for Peace. And one of the things, they sort of looked at the fragility of our world. And one of the things that the report that you all came out with talked about was the importance of looking not only at armed force and military solutions to fighting extremist violence, but also looking for other alternatives. Maybe you could say a little bit about that process, that outcome, and where you see that going.
Sure. Well, the U.S. Institute of Peace Task Force is an outgrowth of an effort to bring leaders together on a bipartisan basis to explore real solutions to the tremendous acceleration in violent extremism we've seen around the world. And I think the main initial point that we have identified and make through the report is that violent extremism is a cause and consequence, is both a cause and a consequence of the extraordinary fragility, poverty, and vulnerability that so many people live with on a day-to-day basis. I've spent, as you point out, a lot of my career working on, say, global health issues and trying to understand why children, often young children, under the age of 5, die from such simple preventable diseases, malaria, diarrhea, etc. This report points out that those tragic deaths, in part because we've been successful at eliminating those deaths in well-governed parts of the world, take place way disproportionately in the most fragile states around the planet. For those of you that saw the New York Times cover this weekend on Sunday, and that tragic photo of the Yemeni child, you understand that those types of human tragic consequences of war, of conflict, and of fragility, we need to deal with the root causes before we are going to be successful at ending extreme poverty and its consequences. And so that report is a serious effort to try to deal with those root causes. In Yemen, I was in Yemen in 2011 and 2013, and we did a lot of humanitarian action. But if we were investing in creating a real viable agricultural economy, reducing the dependence on cot and the water utilization that comes from that particular crop and how they are effectively running out of water, if we did more, especially in the southern parts of Yemen, when they cleared out al-Qaeda after a tremendously tragic period there and were winning a civil war, to give people tools and resources to come back into their communities, restart schools, have economic hopefulness. Some of the tragic consequences that have transpired there since the civil war has accelerated could have been avoided. And the report makes the case that great powers, in this case focused the United States, should be making those kinds of investments really as the forward defense of our national security. Getting girls in school in Afghanistan, ensuring children have access to food in Yemen, making sure that the streets are safe in Mogadishu and there's lighting and public services and basic civilian government, or ensuring that human rights are being observed at border crossings through the Sahel. These are the preconditions for avoiding war and conflict. And the report points out that we have spent almost $6 trillion since 9/11 enmeshed in wars and conflicts. A small percentage of that could avoid some of those dire human and economic costs to our country.
Yeah, I wound up partnering with General Mattis when he was at CENTCOM, and he would constantly say to me, you know, if you guys don't succeed, we don't succeed. You know, there's only so many bullets you can put into a situation. You need, exactly as you're saying, to have a strategy that figures out the development piece, the diplomatic, and the political piece.
Well, Bill McRaven, whom you remember, was
sure.
our colleague who most people know as the, you know, extremely fit for role military four-star leader who successfully led the raid on that captured and killed Osama bin Laden. He conducted, together with USAID and DRL at State, a mapping of the Sahel in West Africa, and would constantly point out to us that the greatest intersections of trafficking in guns and people and drugs took place in and around those communities that had the lowest access to, you know, food and health services and basic civilian government, where family planning indicators were lowest. It's called contraceptive prevalence rate, and therefore the total fertility rate or children per household was highest. And so he would always say we should be doing a lot more on agriculture, family planning, health, and education in these communities, and care deeply about it from purely a national security perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So if we're going to talk, I want to focus mostly on what you're doing at Rockefeller, but if we can just reflect back a little bit to your time in the government at USAID, give us a sense of what you, in a macro sense, what you were trying to do with the U.S. development agenda, and where are some of the places, or a couple of the places you feel you really made a difference, and then what are some of the unmet needs that we still should be paying attention to?
Well, what we were trying to do, I think, is very simple, and it was to make the case and have our policy reflect that that the purpose of aid and assistance should be to put ourselves out of business and give our partners, countries, communities the chance to stand up on their own 2 feet and to grow and to be part of a thriving global community. And that if we did that, we'd have more trading partners and we'd be safer than if, you know, we just isolated ourselves from particularly the toughest parts of the world and then only dealt with the consequences of extreme poverty and vulnerability, whether it's migration or war or terrorist activity or just the consequence of large-scale human deprivation. So with that in mind, I think we had some really important successes, and I'm proud to say bipartisan successes, that we brought Democrats together with Republicans to pass the Global Food Security Act, which supported a program called Feed the Future, which helped 19 countries, you know, dramatically transform their agricultural economies, I think achieving the 6% annualized ag GDP growth rate, which was one of the targets we had set for that effort. In the process, we moved 40 million children out of hunger, not because we were handing out food, but because their families were able to grow more food and lift them up and ensure they were no longer stunted or malnourished. Those types of efforts won a lot of bipartisan support because they were results-oriented. We could measure and take account of how dollars were being spent. They were science-based and science-driven. In many of those efforts, they relied on new seeds and new agricultural inputs. They were ultimately meaningful kind of moral expressions of what America stands for, and people took pride in that. We did the same effort in an effort we called Power Africa, which also passed an almost unanimous basis in a bipartisan way in Congress when they passed the Electrify Africa Act. And I can go on and on. I mean, transforming the way food aid and assistance was provided around the world, optimizing the efforts around humanitarian relief in the Haiti earthquake, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, dealing with migrant children. This is relevant to today, that were showing up at the U.S. southern border and we help put partnerships in place to improve policing and community services and education efforts in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador that for a while decreased the migratory pressure on the U.S. Economy. And by the way, as you know, President Obama dealt with those children at the border by saying we're a country of 300 million people. We can take 30,000 kids who need to be sheltered and supported, and that's just who we are. We're obviously not seeing that today. So it gives me a lot of faith that at Rockefeller, at NYU, like we can come together as civil society and do extraordinary things to solve difficult problems. And I have seen, as you have seen, that when you kind of take risks and do that, even in this fractured political world, people come together. As Democrats and Republicans are so eager to see some progress happen, which is why it's so tragic that our politics are so far from that today.
Yeah, I totally agree. You mentioned a couple of times now agriculture and food, and one of the agendas at Rockefeller is to deal with food, and you've been involved in the African Green Revolution Alliance. We're in Rwanda recently, and I know Strive Masiyiwa, who's a friend and was a longtime trustee of Rockefeller, was very involved in getting that going, as was Kofi Annan. People a lot of times, I think, sort of view Africa as one big continent full of problems and wars and famine and all the like. There's a lot going on there that's really exciting. And this is an example. Maybe you could just give a little flavor of what your involvement's been. Where is it now? What did Kofi Annan have to do? And where do we go from here?
Well, when we looked around the world 15 years ago at hunger and malnutrition, it turns out Africa was the one continent on the planet that actually had food production growth at a level that was lower than population growth for many decades. And as a result, the highest prevalence of hunger and child malnutrition. As many as 45% of all children in sub-Saharan Africa suffered from stunting, which is the hidden hunger of not getting enough micronutrients, and therefore being shorter than you should as a physical sign, but also it affects brain development and your whole potential future. So as a result of that, we and the Rockefeller Foundation has for decades really led the world in investing in agricultural research to lift up humanity as much as possible. Dr. Norman Borlaug, a famous Nobel Prize-winning agricultural scientist, was our longest-serving employee, I think 45 or 46 years in the job, and won the Nobel Peace Prize, because he invented dwarf wheat varieties that led to the Green Revolution. And Kofi Annan in particular felt it was important to bring that concept of agricultural investments in research and science to the agricultural challenges in Africa, and became the first chair of the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, which was a partnership between the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation. Strive Masiyiwa became the second chair of that effort and continues to be the chair of that continent-wide program. And today, the good news is the Rockefeller Foundation and Gates Foundations are a relatively small part of that effort. Countries from first across Africa, I think 10 countries have increased their investments in agriculture to hit their target of 10% of their domestic budget being invested in the agricultural sector, which is important because many of these economies have 50-60% of total employment still in the agriculture sector. And then there are a whole host of partners from around the world, including the United States, European partners, Asian donors, and partners as well. And I'd just say that effort is working. Like if you're worried that we're not making progress at solving some of the toughest challenges we face, I think stunting has gone from 45% to 33% in AGRA countries. I mentioned earlier the ag GDP growth had gone from 1% to 6% over that period of time. These things take time, but they work, and then they lift people up in a way that's really sustainable. And that's what Rockefeller's been trying to do for 105 years, and we now get a chance to figure out how to make that happen for the next decade.
That's great. So we're sitting here in a business school, and one of the challenges, I think, always is to figure out what's the right role for the private sector to play. Strive is from a business. He runs a big mobile phone company, Econet Wireless. I know that he organized also some African business leaders on issues like Ebola.
Yeah.
What's your message for American business leaders? What are they doing well, and what's the unmet need that they should be addressing, in whether it's dealing with agriculture, dealing with jobs, or whatever?
Well, my first message is in reference to Strive. You know, until the recent commodity downturn in pricing, we used to note that as many as 6 out of the world's 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa. I think that number is a little lower today because of the commodity issue. But the reality is, you know, every part of the globe, including Africa, has a lot of economic vitality. And that economic success was driven by people like Strive, business leaders who created businesses, in his case, connecting hundreds of millions of people to mobile connectivity. But a little bit like Strive, you know, now is a time, particularly because governments are often stepping back and saying it's not our responsibility to help others. I think it's important for companies to set the right tone. And your report on putting the S back in economic, social, and governance efforts to measure how companies have impact on the world around them is particularly important. At Rockefeller, we have had a history of supporting impact investing as a field, and we're proud to, you know, be kind of one of the partners helping to make that a reality. But we also know that it's tough for investors and companies to really know in a quantitative way that their work is in fact helping to end human rights violations in a supply chain that might go to Bangladesh or China or other parts of Asia. It's difficult to be able to report with clarity and sophistication that yes, our supply chains are clean and lift people up, as opposed to aid trafficking and cause problems with child labor and the rest of it. So I think the reporting element's particularly important, but first and foremost, you need corporate CEOs to accept the public responsibility that comes with that job. Yeah. And it's not just about shareholder value, it is also about being part of a community, supporting your employees, ensuring you're not breaking the law, but going beyond that and really trying to know what's in my supply chain and am I a force for good in the world or part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things we're trying to push on is just what you said, that when companies have business priorities, they have standards and metrics that go with those priorities. They can measure everything. Just as you were describing, you know, stunting or food in Africa, you have facts and figures, and you can evaluate it's gone from 1% to 6%. We've been, I think, slow in the human rights, labor, supply chain world in coming up with those kinds of metrics that really make every company aware there's a single standard. Here's the data we're going to collect, and here's how you should evaluate yourself and how the world's going to evaluate investors and evaluate what you're doing. So, you know, I think a lot of what you seem to be doing at Rockefeller is tied to those metrics, and that's, I think, the right approach for the S as well as everything else. Well,
and I give you one other example of that. In just one thing we work on here in the United States is the recent tax bill had an amendment that allowed for something called opportunity zones. And these are 8,700 zones around the census tracts that have been designated by governors and approved by the federal government as tax preference investment regions. And they are places where economic activity has been depressed for many decades. And so, you know, if companies are going to get a tax break, or if individuals and capitalists, people who've made, you know, real resources and are experiencing, in this case, effectively a capital gains tax holiday. If you're getting a tax break to invest in these communities, it's important to know, are those investments creating opportunity and lifting people up or not? And it's tough to measure right now. So we're part of a consortia of foundations that are looking at how you might identify how to make those measurements work for the market writ large.
Yeah. Well, that's music to my ear. Let's talk about public health. You're a health guy. You were very involved, both at Gates and in government and PEPFAR in the effort to deal with HIV/AIDS. And most people view that as a quite extraordinary achievement. Again, long way to go still, but turn the corner in some fundamental ways. Give us a flavor of where we are in terms of these public health issues that you're dealing with at Rockefeller. Some issues like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, a lot of money, a lot of attention. I was on a board of a group that was looking at neglected tropical diseases, and it was hard to find the allies in Congress who said, we have to do that. Give us a kind of a map of where we are in the public health space, and again, what's Rockefeller's strategy? What are you doing about it?
Well, I'd say first it's important to recognize there's been a huge amount of success in global public health.
Right.
And as you point out, HIV/AIDS used to be a death sentence for 38 million people, and now that is not the case.
Right.
And it's in large part because of concerted global investment and action. We've made huge strides in reducing the number of children that die from malaria, for example, cutting that almost in half around the world. Tuberculosis is actually on the rise because of the association with HIV/AIDS, but would be much, much, much worse if there hadn't been a global fund for AIDS, TB, and molecular and tuberculosis. So that's been great. On other diseases like polio, there's been a lot of progress, although it's not completely eradicated. And as you point out on schistosomiasis and the other things you worked on in that space, we've been successful. The challenge, though, has been we're starting to see that success flatten. So we focus a lot on the third Sustainable Development Goal, which is ending maternal and child death around the world, preventable maternal and child death. And the world has been succeeding at bringing child deaths down. For example, it was 12 million, I think, in 1991, and is today just under 6 million, which is phenomenal progress. But that progress is slowing because, frankly, just handing out bed nets for children to sleep under is no longer sufficient to, they're not dying of mosquito bites as high prevalence. Today it's neonatal mortality and it's sepsis at childbirth and the like. So we are focused on an effort to end preventable maternal and child deaths by working in partnership with countries and partners like UNICEF around the world, and frankly bringing advanced data analytics to the task. It turns out that, if you even think about something, you see it in your, on your phone or on a website that you're on as a targeted ad. We think you can use the same kind of predictive analytics to identify which households, which communities are most vulnerable for different diseases, and use that to get ahead of the disease curves and save lives. I think that approach is what helped drive down Ebola incidents in West Africa in 2014. And we see that working today to reduce, for example, cholera deaths in Yemen as part of the humanitarian effort there. And we think that approach can be deployed more aggressively to really help us end preventable maternal and child death.
That's great. You mentioned cholera. One of the things sort of on the side, I've been trying to help some people who are trying to get the UN and global community to respond to cholera in Haiti.
In Haiti, yeah.
And when at the end of the Obama term, I went to Samantha Power. We were trying to push the U.S. to be supportive. I think the U.S. has committed about $10 million towards a $400 million goal. The UN, of course, brought cholera through its peacekeepers. What's your advice for me and my friends who are trying to push this agenda?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, they are looking to do sort of a social impact bond on cholera through the UN. I think that's a great effort. We're actually helping to structure that bond with Josette Sheeran and the Asia Foundation. And I think that could be a way to raise the resources to be successful. And is indicative of a larger point that when you can structure financial instruments that to raise money in an outcomes-based way, that can sometimes be an easier way to raise money for public causes today than just straight appropriations. But that's one word of wisdom. A second is there are better tools and products these days that help to reduce the prevalence of diarrheal disease in particular. And the world has relied largely on oral rehydration solution. I first learned about cholera at the ICDDRB, which is an old cholera hospital that was set up in Bangladesh. And they literally have cholera cots. Children sit on these cots. There's plastic and then a hole in the middle, and they suffer through having the disease while their mothers give them oral rehydration to keep them alive as they're having a severe diarrheal episode that can go on for days. And that has worked for decades to save children's lives. But today we know so much more about basic nutrition, and there's a whole range of products and solutions that children can have that I know UNICEF is trying to get to Haiti and distributed more effectively to children that can help them survive a cholera episode much more effectively. So that's the second piece of advice: is innovation and science is still going to be transformational. And the third is, cholera did come from the Nepalese peacekeepers. That's now been acknowledged. But it does spread through a lack of sanitation and hygiene. And simple things like hand washing and support for basic sanitation and hygiene can have a huge impact. And we together worked on the Haiti earthquake relief. One of my proudest moments before cholera hit was that 6 months after the earthquake, Port-au-Prince had a lower diarrheal disease incidence rate than the day before the earthquake. And it was because of a huge focus on water, sanitation, and hygiene in the early part of the response. And I was made fun of for talking about diarrhea in my very first National Security Council meeting. Everyone's like, okay. But that is, that's the challenge. And I think if you and others can do those three things in Haiti, they can be very successful at reducing the prevalence.
I think of the 400 million, 200 million is really for that
impact bond.
It makes a lot of sense. The broader question, I guess your comment on impact bonds makes me think is, there seems to be a fatigue among donors. Of course, the U.S. historically has been a leader, and there's much less appetite in this administration for leading. But if I look at the refugee population and displaced population, 65 million people now displaced from their homes because of war and various instability. I don't know if impact bonds are the answer there. It does strike me that on some level we also have to keep the pressure on governments to stand up for the things that are right. And I do worry in places like Syria, Yemen, elsewhere, we have an awful lot of people that are pretty desperate.
Absolutely. Do you recall what's the current level of refugee flows into the U.S.? I know the number's been coming down and down and down.
So I actually wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago. The number that the administration, at the end of the Obama term, we were admitting 100,000 refugees, or that was the ceiling. It was 80 or 90,000 at the end of the Bush administration. So this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. We let in about 20,000 this year, and the administration has set a cap of 40,000 for next year, but we're not going to get anywhere near that. I think we let in this fiscal year, which is about to end, ended last month, I think we let in 45 people from Syria.
That 45 people from Syria is shameful.
Yeah.
And it's shameful partly because, and you had to carry this message throughout the region, and we spend a lot of our time asking other countries to take hundreds of thousands of refugees just from Syria. And so I just think in general for us, and obviously Rockefeller is a private institution, but American leadership on these issues, as you point out, is just essential. It's essential to build coalitions and partnerships. We are an American private institution, and we see around the world, whether the task is, building a new coalition to invest in sustainable protein production for emerging economies, or building a coalition to bring people together to both accelerate investment in these opportunity zones, but also measure whether they're having impacts on reducing poverty. Leadership is central to getting these things to be successful, and it's really sad to hear those are the refugee numbers for the most powerful country in the world.
Yeah. And, again, I think one of the challenges for all of us going forward is to kind of reinvigorate the bipartisan coalition. The refugee issue really began after World War II and the Holocaust. And there was always a real strong sense that Democrats and Republicans could come together. This is who we are. It's our history. It's, we're the melting pot. And there's a real need for us to continue to lead. As you say, we're asking everybody else to do it. We have to step up. I want to turn to another area that's part of your ambitious big portfolio, which is the issue of jobs and economic opportunity. When I teach my classes, I always say that the greatest human rights development progress over the last 40 or 50 years has been the reduction of global poverty. 2 billion people were living below the extreme poverty level in 1975 or 80. 77% of the people in East Asia were living below the poverty level. Now it's way under 10%. So that's to me, if you take a broad view of human rights, and I do, that's the headline. It's extraordinary. And what's driven that more than aid or more than the World Bank is jobs. We have a global economy that's put people to work. And I deal with a lot of the challenges of those workplaces, but you have to start by saying it's better that people have moved into the cash economy for the first time they're getting opportunity. Give us a sense of what you're trying to do, because another aspect of this, as we've put people into work, we've also seen a growing disconnect between rich and poor, greater polarization. I think Oxfam said the 42 richest people in the world have the equivalent income of the bottom 3.5 billion. So we live in a world that's both got opportunity but also great inequality. How do you view this issue of economic opportunity, jobs, poverty alleviation, and what's Rockefeller doing about it?
Well, first I'll just say, as one of the world's foremost leaders on human rights, to hear you articulate that connection between a job and your economic opportunity as a basic human right is both exciting and important, for everyone to think about. I'd say we work on this issue at home and abroad. And at home, our focus is, we've studied the nature of economic opportunity in America, been highly influenced by work that Raj Shetty and others have led out of Stanford and the like, that have shown that really, if you were born in the 60s or 70s, you had a 90% chance of doing better than your parents economically. And unless your last name was Rockefeller, then it was tougher, mostly because of your parents. But, if you were born after 1980, and certainly more recently, it's less than 50%. That's just transformational for the American economy and for the hopefulness that comes with believing you will have the dignity of work and the ability to be part of a community that's moving upward. When we localize that even more, we see, if you take out New York and San Francisco and a few other major metropolitan areas, it's even more dire. And so this idea of place-based economic opportunity is very significant to the fabric of our country. And that's why we've spent a lot of time on issues like the Opportunity Zone legislation. We feel that could actually motivate many billions of dollars of capital formation and deployment, specifically in census tracts that, in general, have a 30+% poverty rate, a 13% unemployment rate, a minority population, African American, Hispanic American population of 54%. So places that are appropriately targeted as being more vulnerable parts of the economy. And that's why we're putting a lot of effort into that domestically. We've also entered into a partnership with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to identify creative and innovative community development programs that could be scaled in those contexts. Internationally, we focus a lot on power and energy access as a driver of getting onto the ladder of being in having that upward economic mobility. Something I think I learned, we both saw, was just if you don't have access to electricity, you don't really have the chance to be part of a global economy and to be productive in human work. And so we have programs that we call Smart Power that are expanding access to power for low-income communities in rural India, for example, where through using rural mini-grids, which are solar installations that can serve a handful of villages and 600 to 1,000 households, and then we charge those households for power, and we find they're willing to pay even a very high price by American standards for power, like 28, 29 cents a kilowatt hour if it's good, clean, available power, and they use that access to power to help move themselves out of poverty. Women who get sewing machines and manufacture garments or something else, or agricultural, automated agricultural production and processing on their farms helps them then move out of poverty over time. So we are expanding those efforts in India and Myanmar and parts of East Africa because we think that's critical to the fight to end extreme poverty. And I'd go so far as to say, I think we should redefine poverty in energy consumption terms. And if we did that, you would see a lot more people are effectively poor than the current measure, which is based on how many calories a day you can afford effectively. And I think it would map slightly differently, so it would be better for the global development community to target and support those communities that need that lift out of poverty.
So you're going to drive the poverty levels back up again. I'm bringing them down.
Yeah, you have been bringing them down. We don't want to take the actual levels up. We just want to change the measures so people, the aspiration for ending poverty shouldn't just be you have enough food to survive, but you're not able to connect into a global economy. And we should raise the bar, I should say, so that we really are connecting everyone to the kind of economic opportunity and the kind of work that gives dignity and gives, that animates the sentence you said about the reduction in poverty being the greatest success in human rights on the planet.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I want to connect the two things you talked about, the domestic side and the international side. And this may not be Rockefeller's domain, but it is part of the discussion. We had in 2016 a political issue of a trade agreement, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a sense from a lot of people around the country who've either lost their jobs or were insecure that somehow the jobs leaving the country were the cause of their distress. In some cases that was true. In other cases, the jobs had migrated to a machine, they were automated, or the industries had simply moved to another part of the world, they weren't coming back. The garment industry used to be a big deal in New York. It's not today. Or the steel industry in Youngstown, Ohio. How do we honestly talk about that in a way that doesn't give sort of bromides to people that are hurting? There are obviously a lot of people that are anxious and nervous about their own security. We talk about, you mentioned, economic zones and the like. There's lots of talk about job training. I was out in Cleveland some months ago, and a fellow who drove me to the airport, 71 years old, he had worked for a tool and die factory for 30 years, and Japanese companies came in and undercut his company in terms of price and better quality. He lost his job. He's just in despair. He's not going out to Silicon Valley to code for Google. Yeah. And so how do we have a more honest discussion about what the alternatives are? I'm not saying what you're doing is not honest, but how do we go beyond those things to really give people a sense that there's a straightforward conversation about their station in life?
Yeah. I might have to ask you to answer that because that's a tough question. But I'm curious what your reaction is to this thought. There's a lot of truth to that. There have been times in our history, and as we've been thinking about how to be more engaged in working on economic opportunity here in the U.S., we've studied these periods. But there was a time in our history where it was reasonable for most American kids to not complete a secondary education. And I think it was between like 1910 and 1920 something that we changed that such that more than 85% of American kids then started completing a secondary education. The GI Bill, although ending up preferencing kind of white men who served effectively, did provide tens of millions of people a chance to get a secondary education and experience the economic benefits of having that level of education and productivity in the future. We use our tax code all the time to provide incentives and benefits for one cohort or another. There's an excellent book by Richard Friedman called A Few $1,000 that points out that we offer $700 billion a year in different preferences. So home mortgage deduction, if you start pricing all those things. We as a country have come together and said, we're willing to invest in certain types of things, wealth creation through your house, et cetera, et cetera. It seems reasonable that we could take the crux of your question and say, this is a moment for a bigger transformation. And maybe it's the case that everyone should have access to at least a few years of post-secondary education tied to the work opportunities that are realistic for a certain community. Maybe it's the case that automation will lead to large enough scale displacement that we should change the nature of our public benefits and make them portable, make them more accessible, make them more education and training oriented. Maybe we should have an expectation of a service year or a service year connected to potential scholarship benefits so that people who choose to serve in their communities in the U.S. can then go on and go to college and get support for that. Maybe, and this is a little far afield from what we do at Rockefeller right now, maybe we should offer every American child a birth account so that grows over time and can be used for education and training, because we know the data show that even a few $1,000s over time can change the expectations people have of themselves. And I would bet most of the wonderful students that come to this great institution have from a young age felt like if they worked hard and played by the rules, they were going to get a shot at doing something great, like maybe even going to NYU someday. And why shouldn't every American child have that same expectation? So I don't know that philanthropy is the answer to that. On almost every one of those examples, we are, as the Rockefeller Foundation today, doing something to explore the idea and build the partnerships and see if it could work. But it's not, philanthropy is not going to solve that. That's going to take real political work, building those bipartisan institutions and partnerships, and saying, let's aspire for something big precisely because we live at a time of such profound disruption.
Yeah. All of that makes sense. And I think for philanthropy to be the kind of incubator where ideas are hatched, surfaced, and then at an appropriate moment, government can come on in and make policies. You've had enough of me, and we have some people on the line. This is online. A couple of questions have come. And
okay.
The first is, what can we do to compete with investors who are buying up affordable housing in major cities across the U.S. and thereby creating a lack of affordable housing and homelessness?
Well, I'm glad to get that question, because we just completed a call for proposals for funds related to the Opportunity Zone legislation with the Kresge Foundation. And what we found is that almost 60% of them are related to real estate. And of those, or maybe more, of those, a high percentage have, as part of the project, commitments to affordable housing. And to me, that's one of the examples of where foundations and philanthropic partners might be able to come together and preference those investment funds that are making the extra commitment in difficult communities to make affordable housing available, or to pursue worker training programs, or to look at employee stock ownership and make ownership and capital asset development more a part of the strategy of their business, and therefore be really putting the S in ESG. I keep looking down at this report because it's Michael's great report on how to think about measuring social impacts in business investment.
Thanks for the plug.
You're welcome.
We have another question here, which is in some ways along the same lines. It's how do we integrate a rights, this is from Binish Riaz of New York. The first was from Tammy from California. How do we integrate a rights-based approach into these programs so they're not just top-down initiatives? In other words, how do you ensure that local communities participate in the creation, propagation, and sustenance of these programs?
So that strikes me as two different questions.
Yeah.
One, maybe you should address on what a rights-based approach means to you in the context of the work that we do. From our end, the second part of that question about how do you get community engagement, I'll just use as an example the Smart Power projects I was describing in India, we've now supported, I think, about 160 of these mini-grid installations that serve in total about 70,000 people. In those cases, the households, low income as they are and lacking electricity, to give you a sense of their kind of quality of life, they're actually the customer. So they're the payer, and while there's a subsidy involved, they're buying and paying for power and electricity. And that model forces our partners, which in that case are private companies, to be very responsive to their customers, provide high quality electricity, make sure if you say you're going to deliver electricity, it works at night, which, believe it or not, is not the case in most government provided utility electric connections in rural India. And so I've always felt that commercial models, even if they're not 100% commercial and involve blended capital or public subsidy, have the benefit of giving customers voice because they're the customer. So that's one way to do that. Another way is just real sensitivity to the importance of those efforts. And in our evolving health work, for example, listening to the people you serve and having community health workers have digital tools so they can listen to and relay data back to health services providers about the customers they try to serve is another important example of that. But I am curious what you would say on the rights piece, because I've struggled with that for a long time and feel like it's so important, and yet it's important to make it real in the context of the work we do.
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things real quickly, and then I want to open up for some questions from the audience here. I think there's two pieces to that. One is the question of how governments navigate a development agenda and a rights agenda and make sure that they're reinforcing of each other. We're having a lot of discussion about sustainable development goals. A lot of people having those discussions are thinking only in sort of the technical terms. What are the things we need to do to invest in various efforts? A lot of those investments don't work if there aren't governments that are respecting rights. And so I think there's a need to kind of, I often with AID missions in Egypt and places, I would go in and say, we can pretend that we're having an effect, but we also have to be sure that it's going to the place it's supposed to be going, and that there are remedies if it doesn't. We need court systems. We need open media. And that ought to be more centrally the way I think aid is projected, either from governments or the World Bank.
And so I agree with that. And I used to, and still do, believe all of this work is fundamentally political. Yeah. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Right. We used to demand for our Feed the Future partnerships, and AGRA today, the alliance we spoke about, they demand a certain level of political commitment to what percentage of your public budget's in agriculture before engaging a country as a partner. Right. And that's appropriate because you got to have skin in the game from your counterpart colleagues. Similarly, we are expanding our smart power effort into Myanmar, and we have spent a lot of time looking at ensuring that happens in a manner that is supportive of human rights and the reality of what's happened in Rakhine State and elsewhere. Right. And we proudly supported Oxfam and a group of other civil society organizations in a timely way when they needed it, to ensure that we stood for those communities and their rights in the context of our desire to allow for rural electrification as well. The two have to go hand in hand.
Yeah. And the other piece I will say just in a sentence is that I think smart companies are also recognizing that their interests are best served when they're operating in a rights environment. Myanmar would be a great example. I was there this summer. But I was in Cambodia a week ago with 7 apparel companies meeting with the government about the lack of a democratic process and the lack of labor rights, which are making their rights, they're making the companies nervous because the European Union is about to cut preferential trade status to Cambodia. Wow. So they were there in, I would say, a combination of an altruistic concern, we want a better environment, but also recognizing that these things have an economic consequence. Market, floor's open. I'd love to get some questions, please, and please introduce yourself. There's somebody with a mic who's about to show up next to you.
Christine Negra, First Vision, and thank you very much for the conversation. So my question is sort of in the vein of nutrition and food security and the context of achieving those global goals, and picking up on the theme of private sector. It'd be great just to hear what's happening at Rockefeller on dietary diversity, where you see that opportunity, and both kind of in the programming that you do, and then your partnerships in the private sector. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We just announced a new leader for our food and nutrition work, whose name is Dr. Roy Steiner, who comes to us from the Omidyar Network. And in fact, dietary diversity is his big focus. You know, how do you get, and for those of you that are not nutrition experts, there's been a big debate about, over time, how do you get micronutrients to kids who are more vulnerable, well, to families who are more vulnerable. And a lot of the standard practice, driven by the way the American food system has worked for decades, for a whole host of reasons, has been invest a lot in the production of grains, and then process food, and then fortify food with the micronutrients you'd like people to have, and get that out there. And the alternative, of course, is what you're referring to, dietary diversity. Just eat a balanced and diverse diet with fresh fruits and vegetables in particular, and that's been deeply underinvested in around the world. Almost everywhere but the Netherlands and maybe Israel has gone the invest in grains route and has not invested in dietary diversity strategies to address malnutrition. And if you believe, and we do, that the global food system is making people sick, it both keeps almost 1 billion people severely malnourished or undernourished, and perhaps twice as many people suffer from obesity and the consequences of a food system that pushes people in that direction. We need to change the way we produce food around the world. And it's not just in Africa. It is in fast-growing emerging markets like China that will account for the bulk of the world's protein consumption 25 years from now. And it is right here in the United States where, everything from child obesity to the way we have food deserts in American society where people can't get access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Or food for that matter, is really a problem and a solvable one. So we're very focused on the research and science elements of that, but also some of the policy partnerships that can expand access to more diverse diets at home and around the world.
Great, please. And again, microphone's coming.
Very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the jobs component, and you mentioned specifically opportunity zones. I had read recently a good book called Winners Take All, and it talks about how we continue to use the same economic models, the Silicon Valley models, the financial markets, to try and alleviate the problems instead of maybe systematically changing how we do business in some respects. It's obviously a controversial thing, but we have a president who's a real estate developer, and he's put opportunity zones which ask investors to invest in economically depressed areas, and there's questions about gentrification and the long-term viability of those sorts of things. And I just wondered what your reaction is to that, and certainly, you've talked about, and there are many very good things you're doing. I'm just curious to know what you think about, particularly with partnerships you have with technology firms that have helped create the, I guess you call it a shared economy, but service-based economy for the working poor as well, which has all these complex externalities.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm going to first address the opportunity zones and then talk about the book for a second. On the opportunity zones, I'd say the following. I think this is the largest sort of impact investment experiment going on in the United States, and that has taken place in the U.S. in some time. Our joint call for proposals with the Kresge Foundation elicited some number, I don't recall how many proposals at this point, I think about 140 or so. And the total headline capital raise within those 140 funds, if you extrapolate a little bit, is about $12 billion. So, and that's just one set of funds that responded to a call for proposals that ostensibly are more interested in impact because they're reaching out to Rockefeller and Kresge and want to be assessed on those impact terms. When we looked at the proposals, 40% of them were not real estate transactions, which I found surprising. I actually thought they might all just be real estate, right? So there were CDFI projects, there were efforts to support lending to operating businesses, there were efforts to do new business starts, there were some technology startup investments. So it was a little more diversified than just real estate. I'd also point out that almost all in that bucket had kind of real impact measures that they were proposing. A lot of them were about affordable housing, as we spoke about before. And then finally, there have been examples of community development that are more inclusive than those that lead to gentrification as a singular outcome. And we were proud to have join us Deborah Wright, who was the CEO of the Harlem Empowerment Zone and the head of the Federal Carver Savings Bank, the Carver Federal Savings Bank, I'm sorry. And, access to credit, financial services, savings, worker training, investments that are part of a shared economic development plan for a lower income community. Those are the types of things, if they are truly done in public-private partnership, that can leverage this $12 billion of investment and turn it into progress for the almost 30 million people that live in the currently designated opportunity zones. So, I'm not naive about the concept that this might end up being just a boon for real estate developers. That could be an outcome. But I also think it is incumbent upon those of us that care about impact and care about lifting people up to figure out how to take this experiment and make it successful on behalf of those 30 million Americans that live in these designated zones. And I take some comfort in the fact that the designation of the zones happened quickly, largely in a data-driven manner, and did in fact capture communities that have been left out. And that can be documented and measured. So, okay, so now on the book. I don't know how many folks here or online have read the book, but it is clearly getting a lot of attention. My big takeaway and my advice, but also kind of call to action for folks involved in philanthropy and civic society is that your efforts matter. Like, you have to be, as Professor Posner said earlier, the drivers of change, the innovators, the people willing to take risks to demonstrate what's possible. And you have to be the advocates to ensure that we live in a country whose politics make it happen at scale. And when you ask me the question about opportunity in this country, I keep reverting to these big, grand-scale policy and political decisions, because I actually believe great philanthropy, like the Rockefeller Foundation did decades ago in the case of Social Security, can bring people together and lead to an outcome, like the Social Security Act, that helps to create more justice and opportunity in our country. We don't do those things alone. We're part of a group of people that bring a commission together that work for many years and collect data and demonstrate something's viable. But ultimately delivering real success is only going to come with real political and policy change. And that's up to all of us, not just those folks we elect and put into office.
I don't know, Raj, if you had this reaction, but one of the things I felt very strongly was that when you're in government, you're often reactive to things that are going on. And it really is up to people outside and in philanthropy or in the academy to be thinking creatively with the ability to take a step back and say, what should it look like? And to bring those ideas into the system. You can't do it without government, but government can't do it without people on the outside feeding fresh ideas into the system.
Yeah, I very much endorse that.
Yeah. There's another question, please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Alfredo Espinosa. I come from Vital Strategies in New York City. And I'd like to ask you if you could please elaborate a bit more on your vision for using advanced data analytics to support the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal number 3.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So as I mentioned, SDG 3 is about maternal and child health around the world and here at home as well. America has extraordinary disparities in health outcomes, more so than any other industrialized country on the planet. And basically, in the poorest parts of the world, we actually know how to save the lives of mothers, children, people who are vulnerable because of malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia, neonatal birth complications, and death around childbirth. And it's not costly. It's often simple things: better lighting and a skilled attendant at birth, a little bit of antibiotics being accessible should a child get an infection in the first 48 hours of life, the ability to both sleep under a bed net, which I made reference to earlier, and importantly, when a child has symptoms, be able to get a particular type of therapy, artemisinin-containing therapies for malaria, that are more robust at addressing that illness than other single drug solutions. And all of those solutions cost pennies per dose, or in a high cost case, dollars per case. So we're not talking about, thousands of dollars of investment per child to save a life. We're talking about relatively low cost stuff. The hard part is finding the children who are vulnerable and finding the mothers who are likely to perish in childbirth and reaching them. Because the whole point of being a public health worker, if you're in Rajasthan in India, or if you're in a certain part of northern Uganda, where you've done a lot of work, is that you feel like you're on your own. There's not enough capacity to reach every household with basic services. And if you can only reach 10 or 15 or 20% of the households that need to be reached, are you reaching the ones who are most vulnerable? And so we today know how to do the targeting and mapping. In Yemen, we talked about cholera. They basically took the current incidence of reported cholera, UNICEF did this, then did some predictive analytics based on projected weather patterns and where it was raining and where it might rain, and had a significant reduction in cholera incidence by going to those communities that were vulnerable before other people got there. We were just working with the people who lead immunization campaigns around the world. They point out that when they run an immunization campaign, they largely immunize the same kids over and over for polio and measles and anything else that lends itself to a campaign. And yet the kids dying from polio and measles are outside that system. They're not showing up when there's a campaign. So identifying those particular children and targeting them and reaching them is the name of the game to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. And we think data prediction, predictive analytics, simply having better data quality can make a huge, huge impact. And I will say, and then I promise I'll stop, but in the Ebola crisis in 2014, the world was panicked. Our country was panicked. The people were talking about, the CDC had released a report talking about 1.6 million deaths due to Ebola, 1.6 million cases of Ebola. And at the time, there was a 70% mortality rate from Ebola, just off the charts. The reason it went away without ever reaching our shores is because a group of epidemiologists sat in Liberia, built a data system that allowed us to know which particular child or which particular father was infected, and we could be much more specific at targeting the community around that infected individual in a much more targeted way. That's simple. There was a spreadsheet that actually a scientist named Hans Rosling, who has since passed away, from Sweden, would send around to all the public health leaders. That simple data on targeting who had Ebola or likely had Ebola allowed all the global resources to be focused where it mattered, and Ebola went away within months, effectively. And so I'm very optimistic this can be achieved, and there's no reason why we can't bring the same tools that allow Google to know that I'm searching for a pair of golf shoes to help us find out a far more important task, which is which mother is pregnant and so severely malnourished and lives in a community served by underperforming health clinics, such that she's very highly likely to perish in childbirth should there be a complication. We can figure that out with data and analytics, and it's our responsibility to do so.
I think we're at the end of the hour here. I just want to ask one last question. You're at a business school. We got some business students here. Any words from your present purge, from your government purge, what should business students be thinking about as they head out of Stern and go into the world? How can they make a difference?
Well, anything you do is going to make a difference. So with that in mind, please, please, please make sure you're making a difference on the side of, good. And that's a lot of, Michael, your work in helping to discern which companies, which businesses, which enterprises are truly doing the right things and being change agents for the future, and which ones are getting away with looking the other way. And I hope you'll vote with your feet in that context. In a larger sense, I would just say whether you end up, in finance or consulting or the social sector, I would find a way to be a part of shaping what our society is like. It is not, I love the question about that winner takes all book, because it's not okay we are worse off as a society if we leave the task of social justice, of expanding opportunity in this country, of fighting poverty around the world, of dealing with fragility and conflict, if we leave those tasks only to the professionals. Because as you pointed out, the professionals are busy. The professionals are often forced to do what they've been doing. And you are NYU Stern School business graduates. You are creative, you're optimistic, you have a set of tools that a lot of people don't have about what artificial intelligence is going to be like in the future, what it means to do creative marketing, how you tie all that together with advanced financial modeling. And those skill sets, I have seen time and again, are super important for us to succeed in the bigger effort to create a more just world. And so I'd ask you to not let yourself off the hook. And even if you end up in the private sector, that's fantastic. We need you there. But remember, you're a part of this fight, and please make sure you do something about it.
Raj, thank you for sharing this hour and for all you're doing at Rockefeller, and we want to have you come back.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.